This is an NBC News Bulletin.
This program contains the truth and is void where prohibited, taxed, or otherwise restricted by law. Do not fold, spin, or mutilate this program. Vyzygoth's Grassy Knoll continues.
All right, this is Think or Be Eaten, and I have no idea what to expect. And I have great trepidation. We have with us today Andrew Colvin. He needs no explanation. Well, he might need an explanation. And Robert Denton, who's been with us of late and continuing to do the Civil War series. Both these gentlemen have had experiences in and around the Ohio Valley, pretty much on Robert's side from an archaeological and perhaps somewhat mystical sense. And Andy, of course, we can't go on. I mean, there's been like 1,000 hours of us talking about what he's found there. But the thing that I had mentioned to two of them is they've always spoke separately about the influence of other ethnicities, race in the United States, what we now know as the United States, before the Vikings maybe and before Christopher Columbus, who I never understood anyway. So we're going to talk about it today, and I have no hope at all that I'll be able to constrain these two. So without saying anything further to insult them, let me throw it to Robert first. You have been in that same area that Andy has. And just tell us, can you give us a thumbnail of what you found there? Because and not necessarily from a hard science perspective, which we will talk about, but is there something going on there? I mean, Andrew's always said, and I trust him for it, I mean, there's been enough evidence of it. But you've had situations out there too, haven't you?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it's, and I never really, years ago, before I was actually even involved in any kind of, research or regarding, ancient cultures or the archaeology of that area or the mound builders or anything like that, one of the things that always struck me whenever I would go out to, either, whatever you want to call it, the Ohio River Valley or the Ohio River Valley and its tributary valleys was the best way to explain it, you kind of cross the crest of the Appalachians and you go into this region and there is a heaviness, is the easiest way I could describe it, from an intuitive, visceral point of view. There's a heaviness in the air, and it has nothing to do with the industries or anything like that. It's just there's a change in, I don't know what I would call it, the telluric force, that kind of thing, where there's a whole different vibe. And it a couple times that I've been out, it really was, the vibe was so heavy that I almost was, practically thankful to get back across the crest of the Appalachians again and back into the more familiar territory where I live here, in the eastern Alleghenies. And it's very strange. It's not that far away. I mean, when you really come right down to it. But then I started, looking into the background of what kind of cultures lived there and what sort of both the human history and then the, mystical or spiritual or parapsychological history of the are and things. That's when things started to get a lot more intriguing.
Andrew, you lived on the other side of that ridge about which Robert speaks. What are your observations? I mean, you called it home, so.
Right, and you grew up there.
Yeah, what can you say? It's kind of closed. There's a closed society, and there's an observation of the class distinctions. Isn't there? No, is he from? No, he's from West Virginia. There's a politician running now on the platform of, I made my money the old-fashioned way. I inherited it.
I stole it. Yeah, okay.
Okay. So you've got these wealthy people living in South Hills with huge inheritances, and sort of everybody else is just, we're just there to serve them. I was from across the river, so, but you have some of your Hollywood stars emanating from there, from the South Hills part of town. A lot of them go to Ivy League schools and so forth.
Well,
but it's sort of that model that we're heading toward throughout the country. Because really, what's happening now is what already happened in West Virginia 50 years ago with the outsourcing, and even longer than that, because oil and gas were first discovered there, or at least the gas part, and certainly the first oil was made there from coal. That sort of led to this whole complex of plants there that were colluding with the Nazis and so forth.
And technically, the oil that was found in Pennsylvania was really found in that region too, Andy. I mean, it's out in it's out there in basically in the Ohio River drainage. From the extent, from a geographic or geological point of view. So it's in the same province. There's really no distinction.
There may be a couple of levels here, but let's just deal with the more modern just for the moment. Why was that place, founded, if you will, or at least provided the home for a lot of these chemical companies and such? What was it about the place that lent itself to that, or is it just the luck of the draw?
That's a good question. That's kind of a geologic question, isn't it, Robert? Like why?
Yeah, it's not a luck of the draw at all. I mean, it's kind of I think one of the reasons that a lot of these heavy industries were drawn there was because there was already, you have this conjunction of things. You've got transportation networks, and mainly the railroad, and you've got the rivers themselves, which of course there's still big barges going up and down those rivers carrying coal and other stuff. And so you've got kind of you've got the transportation infrastructure that was already there. You've got the raw materials that's going to lend itself towards heavy industry. Of course, the industries that started out was really that's where we get hard or soft coal mining combined with the access to limestone. And of course, all you need is iron ore, and then you've got the ingredients for a steel industry, and that's what really got, the steel industry started in Wheeling and arguably in Pittsburgh. I mean, as soon as basically steel was invented in the late 19th century. So you've already got heavy, dirty industry going out in that area. And then it's kind of a natural segue, if you will, to go to the chemical industries. And the thing with the chemical industries is that what better place to put, let's say for a good example, I think the big Union Carbide plant that's in, where is it, Andy? Is it right in Charleston, or is it in Dynamite? I can't remember, but I know there's a carbide plant there.
Well, yeah, there's two
of them. Okay.
And they're in one's at, there's a big S curve in the river, and one's at one end and one's in the middle of the S.
Okay. And the carbide plants, of course, the thing is that what do they make there? Well, they make the same thing. One of the things they make there is the same thing they made at Bhopal, India, which is isocyanate. It's one of the raw materials. It is basically the raw material for urethane, polyurethane. Well, methyl diisocyanate is, in its raw form, is one of the most toxic substances known as far as chemical substances are concerned. It basically contains cyanide as part of its structure. And, it sounds pretty mercenary, but the bottom line is if the plant blows up like the one did in Bhopal, the poisonous vapors are going to be trapped in the valley there. So rather than, getting picked up by the westerlies and wiping out millions of people, it's going to wipe out tens of thousands of people. Not like that's a real consolation. But
my cousin is a supervisor at that plant and actually handles that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's scary stuff. And I mean, it's exactly the same stuff that wiped out an entire city in India. And so that's part of the rationale too, is just the simple isolation of that area and the fact that, God forbid there's a serious accident. It was thought to be that you could contain the risk if there was any such thing. But
I was amazed. Go ahead.
No, go on.
I was amazed to find out the carbide's still operating.
Oh yeah. I
thought they had, been broken up or split off, and it was, but it's still cranking, and they're still there.
Yep, absolutely. And a lot of the chemical operations there are still going. I mean, I work closely with West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, and it's kind of amazing that there's there's sort of this kind of a wink and a nod relationship. The bigger the industry is, the more of a wink and a nod they seem to get, which is not really surprising.
No.
That's the thing.
Let me throw something at you too, Andy, real quick. I want to go back to Robert as well. Do you remember a couple of years ago when we both got an email from a listener out, I don't know where that was, Huntington or Charleston, and I don't know if a picture was attached, but it was a woman, and she wrote that, what was it, that she had,
Well, she was thinking that they were making Nazi-style gases at the BASF plant, and then I found that before that it had been Standard Ultramarine, which was a Standard Oil, basically the only place in the world that makes a certain kind of blue dye that's used in everything. And it used to be in Chansey, Ohio, which is up near Athens, and I happened to be in contact with a woman whose grandfather was the vice president or president at one time, and she said it had been founded by, quote, Nazis, and that her grandfather had been in the Civil Air Patrol, and that they had flown. The CAP was keeping track of sort of monitoring the plants.
This would be post World War II, right? At the time, quote, the Nazis were running the place.
Well, yeah, but it was set up before that. It was set up in the early 1900s and by Germans, I think.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the thing is that's always been, it's sort of one of the kind of the worst kept secrets of the chemical industry, the global chemical industry, is that that industry is amazingly incestuous. There's no such thing as people working in the chemical industry in Germany who are somehow different or separate from the chemical industry in the United States or Britain or wherever. They may have national boundaries in between. It's kind of, because in a sense they sort of view themselves, even with the strange things they do, I mean, they kind of view themselves first and foremost as scientists, and scientists in a sense don't tend to really respect national boundaries, from that point of view. Mm-hmm. But the Germans there was no way around it. I mean, if you look at the history of chemistry and chemical research, I mean, they were definitely the ones. I mean, they really, pushed that forward, especially in the late 19th century, a lot further than anyone else ever did. And right down to, elucidating, very complex chemical structures and things, and doing it, by, something that only the patience of a Germanic person could really do, which is essentially breaking these compounds down and then weighing the byproducts, and then the kind of back calculating the structure from it, which is, it's amazingly laborious, tedious, but they did it nonetheless, and that's what sort of gave rise to the whole global chemical industry, and so they're all intertwined. There's no, Bayer was here in this country at the same time that Bayer was in Germany making as one of the suppliers of Zyklon B. Mm-hmm. So whose Bayer are we talking about? Are we talking about Bayer U.S.? Are we talking about Bayer Deutschland?
So I have a problem taking anything from Bayer, internally from a company that also makes pesticides and poisons.
Well, that's it.
It just doesn't work for me.
And Bayer is just, look at these names, Sandoz, things that, Merck. Do they sound German to you? They sure sound German to me.
Well, Sandoz,
and that's because that's where a lot of these industries were founded.
Wasn't Sandoz, I'm thinking that might have been Czech. Could that have been Czech?
Well, Czech, but, let's face it, you can't really, divide the Palatinate from,
Well,
Czechoslovakia was where the Nazis had set up some secret factories that were making special craft, missiles, refining uranium.
Yep.
And remember, too, they conscripted also from the Czechoslovakia, because I knew a guy who's a great stone guy, a good mason, and just a real artisan. And he told me he was living in the Sudetenland. He spoke German, and he got conscripted, and he did not want to go, but he did not have a chance. So off he went. But here's something I'm finding out lately, and I don't want to go too far down that road, though I think it really bears mentioning. I'm reading a book now called The Lusitania, because that thing was another ambush. But then it also takes a look at the Germany we kind of don't know about, because we have a lasting memory now of Germany with regard to the Nazi regime. But what seems to be so interesting is that, if I can just generalize here, it seems that Britain picked the fight in World War I with Germany, because Germany was coming on as a real industrial power.
Right.
And then we had this little problem with Germany not having enough access to, water lanes, and now we're going to get it on. Okay, fine. So now we have the war. Germany loses, gets slapped all around with reparations and such. But it's not a crushed country. And all of a sudden, bang, here they come again. And then they got slapped down again. They come back again. Now they're unified. My point is, I'm not saying there's anything good or bad inherently about Germany, but there's something going on there that the people that came out of that country had such an apparent aptitude for science that they would come and rise up again, like what Andy was talking about, what they were doing back then. And obviously, I think we can all agree, they probably had an anti-gravity craft, at the time at the end of World War II.
They couldn't have done it without, well, that's debatable, I suppose, but they got enormous monies from New York bankers.
Would that be Harriman?
In both wars.
Oh, yeah. Without a doubt, yep.
And it was ingenious what the Nazis did. They set up a completely black physics operation that the SS was running. And the rest of the other, they had one for public consumption with their high-profile scientists, and they had all the unknown guys working in Czechoslovakia and in Thuringia in Germany, cooking up these exotic weapons and using the occult to get there. That's the interesting thing. They were looking at ancient Moorish and other symbols, and you can see this in their designs if you look at some of the things they came up with. Some of the anti-gravity things, everything was based on spins. Okay, but if you look at them, they look exactly like a Tibetan mandala.
Right. That's I was going to say that. I was going to bring that up, but that's something that
it was really brilliant.
Yeah, and in a sense also it's the ultimate sort of cross insemination of science. You go far enough out in science, especially in cosmology, and all these things start boiling down to these principles that it's kind of, in cosmology, it's kind of hard to tell, are they doing science or are they doing mysticism? It's because they sort of collide in that field. And the thing is, and this is something that, when to put this kind of in perspective, I have worked with and know a lot of people, names will not be mentioned, who work in DOD, and I've worked in the Pentagon myself, and, actually was in charge of the big cleanup in the Pentagon's basement. They told us it was fuel oil, but I know what it was. And in fact, there's an entire wing, they call it a wedge in the Pentagon, that's essentially devoted to nothing but, parapsychological research. I mean, this is still, it's to think that, the projects like MK Ultra and, these other projects, Bluebird, things like that they've come to an end. It's the stuff is still going strong. And the thing is interesting. My guys in DOD have told me, they said, what the issue that you've got there is, like any bureaucracy, you end up having, a couple guys who are empire builders that have some, wacky ideas, and they will gather around them, a whole cadre, phalanxes of people who aren't really terribly interested in their wacky ideas, but they're terribly interested in getting the grant money they need to do their own research. Okay, and so the leader of the group, they may write it off and say, yeah, he's wacky, but I'm doing this, extraordinary research into figuring out how to open a dimensional rift or something like that. And so that's the problem, is that you end up getting, people who are sort of these, they're pure scientists. They see this as an opportunity for doing their research, but they're working for someone, who is got some really strange ideas, and I think this is what we get all through, 20th century and 21st century history is, you see the same thing. I mean, look at the SS. One of the qualifications for being in the SS is you had to have a college degree. And many of the people in the SS were, some of them, they represented some of the most educated population in Germany. And so as long as they didn't express any sentiments that were obviously, anti-Nazi, or come out and say that, they were a follower of somebody who had been blacklisted, like, Rudolf Steiner or something like that, they were in. And the thing was, were they all, all these scientists, were they, absolutely dedicated Nazis? That's a good question. What they were was they were interested in doing, this edge research that they wanted to do. And so some of them, I'm sure, were dedicated Nazis. Others were probably not so dedicated. If they were smart enough, most of them were, they would have seen right through the Nazi cultocracy and realized what it was all about. But they said, boy, this is giving me the opportunity to do this work that I want to do, and I know how to, I think I have an idea of how we can build an anti-gravity craft. Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you think, Andy? Do you sort of see what I'm saying with this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they had an enormous black project run by Kamler, who was a brilliant man who organized all these different factories that were in different countries that they had occupied. And they, of course, had the benefit of slave labor. So they had an enormous underground facility in the Thuringia area that was as big as an above-ground concentration camp that had almost 200,000 guys doing nothing but refining uranium.
Right.
They had come up with a different way to do it, but no one. It was a photochemical process. It still hasn't been revealed what that is, but they definitely had tried to. There's like 4 different ways to do it, and they tried them all. And the scientists that were actually doing that were not the big names. The big name guys were kept out of the loop and really didn't know what was going on. And interestingly, they recently declassified some British documents where the British had sequestered these big name scientists and tape recorded their conversations. For a couple of years, they were kept at Farm Hall, and even up to the day of the atomic bomb, they had these guys sequestered and they were listening to their conversations. And you can see in there that one of them had gone to this place in Thuringia and seen the place and knew the proper ratio that you would need to. There's some ratio, and I can't remember exactly how to explain it, but they had a number, and it was 2.8. 2.8, a measurement that was critical for how you can reach critical mass with your uranium. And now when they did the Manhattan Project, they were trying 2.2, and as time went by, they figured out it was more like 2.6. So the Nazis already had already figured out how to do it.
Right.
But
there's probably specific gravity that the purified ore had to reach or something like that.
They were having problems with the plutonium part of it, and and so it seems like they opted for smaller bombs just made of uranium,
right?
That were really very light and could be. And apparently they used a few on the Eastern Front against the Slavs, whom they thought were less than human. They weren't, and it appears that the whole thing about bombing Britain with an A-bomb was sort of a diversion, because Hitler was, to some degree, didn't really want. There were some secret pacts made, it seems.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so he wasn't really going to bomb Britain. It was more that Britain wanted him to go into Russia.
Right. Well, and I think even some of the Nazis, regardless of whether, some of the background motives. I mean, if you look at their racial philosophies, I mean, they would have viewed the British as sort of errant Teutons to begin with. So it was kind of.
Well, apparently a decision had been reached with the Queen that if the Nazis did take over, she would remain queen.
Let me run a couple of things by you, if you don't mind, and forgive me for jumping in there. I just had a really sick idea, but I'm going to start with the last thought I had. I'm going to work back a little bit and offer it to you guys. Now, when you talk about secret pacts, we know Churchill, Hitler, Roosevelt, Stalin, they all knew the handshake. And I think that there was something going on amongst all of them. I think that, for instance, that Germany had to throw the war. I think when Hitler had his assassination attempt, the one that the movie Valkyrie recounts, I actually think that a lot of the high command said, this guy's like throwing this war. I mean, this is not making any sense. Who's successful down in Africa? Rommel, pull him back. I mean, okay, blah, blah, blah. Let me go on from that. I'm just wondering if the Nazis could have come up with the A-bomb, given it to the United States to drop on the Japanese. Now, wouldn't that seem just beautifully racist?
That's what they did.
Okay.
That's exactly what they did.
Teller was he wasn't, Andy, what was Teller? Was he a German national, or was he just, he was German? I think he was German.
Well, what about Oppenheimer, too?
Yeah, Oppenheimer, of course.
But, I never thought about that.
Apparently it came from Patton. General Patton may have gotten some of it, because he went in some weird pathways through Czechoslovakia and through, other parts around, not Berlin. He was sort of going in there all around, and everybody, he may have gotten some, and then there was a submarine that was captured, which was probably Bormann making a deal, giving us what they had, which is a big stock of refined uranium, and 2 bombs apparently were on this submarine, and those were probably the ones that were dropped on Japan. Yeah. But they dropped 3 on Japan, right? One of them didn't go off. And the third one the Russians got it.
I don't know how you guys are going to weigh in on this, and this isn't really all that important, but I'm just going to throw it by you. There are some in some corners that believe that there never were atomic bombs dropped, that they were detonated on site. Now, that means a whole lot of collusion and secrecy and conspiracy. Can any of you buy that? That what they actually dropped were magnesium flash bombs.
That wouldn't change my feelings about it at all.
No, that's okay. Happening. But what that would mean, though, if that were the case, that would even make more of a case for the idea about the Germans give it to the Americans to drop on the little yellow horde. I mean, that's perfect. In its racism. It's perfect. I mean, when you think about it, too, the United States, who do they duke with since the 40s? First you had what? You had with Japan. They go ahead and they ate Chiang Kai-shek, and then all of a sudden, they actually cut his legs out from under and backed Mao. But where do we go fight? Korea, another one of these Asians, you know what I mean? And then Vietnam. It's amazing how the United States has been fighting with Asian peoples, when if you really want to look for bad guys, you should have probably pushed Russia around. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
There's something going on here with a global supremacy elitism.
By the way, Edward Teller was Austro-Hungarian born, and he didn't come to the United States until the 1930s. You've
been at your computer?
Yes, I'm at my computer right now.
That's good.
I'm not at mine, but I remember there were two incidents that Farrell has documentation on, Joseph Farrell, that the Nazis put off, actually successfully tested at least 2 atomic bombs. And in both cases, they have witnesses who say that they shuffled in about 20,000 concentration camp victims and blew them up. And in one case, it blew out the phone service in Berlin for 2 days, because that place wasn't that far from Berlin, Thuringia.
Right. All right. So, if you don't mind, so we're in agreement about the collusion that could have been involved with supposedly, okay, we were opposing the Axis powers, but we're all still honkies, if you know what I mean. Yeah. And your comment, Andy, about, let's slap the Slavs around, well, that makes sense. And then, of course, let's go see what this atom bomb can do on people we don't care about. Now, here's another thing I want to ask you, too.
Well, and also, and the other thing is, just before you go to what you were going to say, to jump in, but I don't want to jump in. Also, just the simple, ease with which, and seeming little consternation that, both the Dulles brothers and everybody else involved with it had in just picking up the entire German intelligence machine, headed by Galen, General Galen, and just sort of bringing them here, lock, stock, and barrel, give them all, blanket pardons. And some of these guys were, admittedly the worst of the worst, and it was just sort of, they're going to help us fight the Russians, so we need them. And it was just it just seemed, it was all so convenient. It's all of a sudden here they are.
And
I think it explains a lot of what's going on right now, in fact.
Yes, it does. That's right.
Especially with healthcare, the fact that so many presidents have tried to get it. And why does everybody in Europe have a good, decent system of healthcare and we don't? That's because they kicked the Nazis out and they all came here.
Right.
He kicked them out and they all came here.
Yeah, but remember something too.
I use the analogy that I've always used, my friend Bob O'Neill has always used, is this idea that, it's like in the old days when people would, when you would get inoculated back in the 1700s, believe it or not, they had smallpox vaccine then, but the way you were inoculated against smallpox was you actually found someone who had smallpox, and you took some of their, the ooze
sores
that was coming out of the sores, and you scratched yourself, and that was the poison, so to speak, was placed into your body, a tiny amount. The problem is that, you could end up dying from the vaccine.
Nope.
It was the same thing. We were vaccinating ourselves, so to speak, and it ended up that the vaccine wasn't a vaccine. It ended up becoming an infection.
But I tell you what, there are doctors out there who have said it has never been smart science. And even if you remember this, I don't know if you guys will or not, but the great spiritual leader of the 18th century, Cotton Mather, tried it and nearly hung him because of his failed experiments. It's just like, look, let the body do what the body's going to do. Don't help it out.
Right.
But of course, as you see, that's also tied into one of the most lucrative businesses in the United States, and who's behind it but the Rockefellers, and that is petroleum and also pharmaceuticals. Bang, there you go.
Big pharma, right? Absolutely.
And all the Nazi spy capital went into the pharmaceuticals, not all of it, but a lot of it.
Sure.
An awful lot of it. And think about it. The thing is, big pharma is arguably far more profitable than petrochemicals. It's just the startup that costs a lot of money. I know because I worked in that industry for 17 years.
Well, and when you posited, Andy, or wondered out loud about affordable health care, first of all, it's funny because I remember seeing this in a speech that Truman gave when I went back looking through the New York Times. Here he is in 46, saying we need health care. They pop all the time, but doesn't it make sense though? We don't have affordable health care because the Rockefellers behind that kind of stuff. And second of all, they really don't want you well. They want you sick so they can push the pharmaceuticals for 30 to 40 years of your life. Can you imagine the three of us, especially our cohort, generationally, what's going to happen to us and those just behind us now who have been thrown on this medication for like 40 years of our life? Your body filters can't handle that. But there's a lot of money to be made, and they don't want you well. Now, if I can, anybody want to hit that last? Because I'd like to move on to something else. Okay?
I'm good with that.
All right, now let me throw something else by you guys. And here's what I'm saying to you, too, as we try to pull back into the North America. But I'm wondering about the Germans. I mean, is there something special about them? I mean, are we looking at some kind of, mystical endowment? I mean, is it just in the genes? Is it like pure water and good food and really great beer? I mean,
it's the German beer purity law, I guess. Started in the 1500s. So I don't know.
Oh, well, good. I mean, I'm being serious. Is there something mojo about them? I don't know.
What do you think, Andy?
It's hard to compare cultures because it gets into that border thing where you're looking at a border and saying something about what's happening in those borders, but it's really about class in every case, really across borders.
Well, I mean,
I think there's
not that much about for upper German society. So,
right. I think there's certain proclivities in every culture that we see. Now, those in those proclivities, it's hard to say how a people's tendency to do one thing better than another people. I mean, I think it proceeds from really the whatever you want to call it, the collective memory or the genetics or a combination of the two of individuals within that culture. Because a culture may hold something in high regard. It's natural selection, but it's natural selection of thought and tendency rather than natural selection of physical characteristics. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's not everything is programmed into our genes. There's stuff that's actually in our brains, and in fact, our brains. What was it? I can't remember if it was Carl Sagan or who it was, but there was a point at which, and I think Tyler or Dan even commented on this, that our brain structure actually has more information stored in it as bits and bytes in the neurons than our genetics does, our genome. And so the question is what really is the information storage unit? Is it the genome or is it the brain? And again, what's the brain, what's the human brain doing? It's really just it's enclosing, some kind of matrix of energy, so to speak. But so if that's the larger storage unit, if that's the bigger computer, then maybe that's where, some of our evolution is taking place, is there. And because arguably we haven't changed physically, in certainly at least 50,000 years, but it's probably more like 250,000 years. If you look at the fossil record, we're not terribly different. Really, we're not different at all. Brain capacity wise, physically, from the so-called Cro-Magnon man. We don't look any different. Our brains aren't any bigger. We're physically the same. Our skeletal structure is indistinguishable. Yeah. So obviously we're not physically changing, but we seem to be changing, and slowly but surely. But it's not a change in the physical corpus, so to speak, anymore. It's a change in the brain. But I think if a culture, back to this issue of what's special about the Germans, if a culture values technological ability and scientific ability, that's what's going to be cultivated and nurtured in that culture. On the other hand, if a culture values whatever, let's say if you look at the people of the Polynesian Islands, for instance, where it was social relationships, hierarchical structures within societies and families and tribes, and the communication between those people, that's what that culture holds dear. And so therefore, and if you have oral traditions of history, that kind of thing, someone who can sing, someone who can speak, someone who can memorize the oral history of a culture, they become very valuable. And so I think cultures tend to propagate and nurture that which is important to them.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
Now, value is really an important concept here. I was going to say, first thing I was going to say when I got back on here was to say, I'm going to blame it all on women.
Send your emails to Andy Colvin. And
can't blame it on women, really, but there is this fascinating thing that I saw on a human sexuality show on Discovery that talked about mammalian sexual behavior. And how it is built in that women, after giving birth, tend to, at a certain age, and this happens with all mammals, when the baby's big enough to get along, they then are driven, and they actually did tests to prove that they're driven to attract other mates. And in the case of women, they did dancing experiments at clubs where they filmed women, and then they found out later from them what their situation was, and they found that women who had children were dancing and dressing more sexually provocatively. And most of this research was done in Europe.
Right.
That's why we never had kids.
Right.
But But
here's what I'm getting at.
Okay.
Then you look at the sex role, at the gender roles, and you see that there are these sort of tried and true beliefs that people sort of have about sexuality, like women get to choose, or unspoken ones, or actually overt ones, like women aren't allowed to marry down on the social scale. And this has a tremendous effect because it means that men can only and keep in mind that when after they have a child and they want to remate with a high value member of the male species in their tribe.
Right.
And so that's where the subjectiveness comes in, is that what is it that the person would see as valuable in that other mate? And that does get formed largely by whatever people are saying, I think. Whatever, if it's a militaristic country, then a military leader becomes a hot item for the women. Mm-hmm. But it has a regulating effect on the men, in the sense that men then see their only path to better have more opportunities for females is to do something that's, quote, an achievement. And I have a good friend who's German, and I actually visited him over there years ago, and he's a perfect example of what we're talking about in terms of his intelligence level and so on. But the only thing I can see that's a problem with it is that it's a little bit too intense. So it's kind of hard. You actually see a stubbornness in that, because he thinks he knows, and he does know a lot, but what happens is people overreach, and then especially men, and they start to believe that their crazy idea is really the answer, when it may not be, and maybe they don't listen to other points of view about it. And they end up with crazy weapons, like supposedly the Germans were working on a infrasound machine that could literally crack apart the earth.
No, that would have been a good idea.
Right. And Hitler was driving this because he was a little nuts about this atomic thing. He really wanted to come up with the perfect bomb. I don't know how I got back around to Hitler, but
hey, listen. Honestly, women have the power in the world. Mm-hmm. Look how many times men are pulled down by guess what?
Right.
How many of them? So
this showed up in a show last night. They were talking about Jesse James, the tattoo guy who's a Nazi, more or less, dresses as a Nazi. His girlfriend just left him, the other Nazi chick. She left him for a guy who was in Motley Crue, who was like her old boyfriend. And somebody made the joke, like, if your girlfriend's leaving you for, the bass player for Motley Crue who has all these drug problems, you've got some problems yourself, buddy. So they were making fun of Jesse James. And she says, no woman should ever screw him again. Now, women could change things if they decided they weren't going to sleep with anybody that was engaging in militaristic action. I mean, think about how powerful that would be. Well, and that's an old Greek story.
That's right.
I was going to say, that's what I was about to say. 2,500 years ago, we have the play Lysistrata. It's like, when the Spartan emissary shows up at the Athenian council, and they say, well, the Spartans come here to talk of peace, but they're carrying spears beneath their cloaks. And they said, no, not spears. And he pulls his tunic aside. He goes, our women aren't having sex with us either.
What tragedy was that in? Was that an
No, it's not a tragedy. That's one of the only. We only have 2 or 3 comedies.
Okay.
By the Greeks, and satires are comedies, and the one where the women, in order to stop the war between Athens and Sparta, is Lysistrata, and they say we're going on strike. No more sex, fellas.
I tell the Chinese that doesn't seem to be working out there. But
Can I go back to the thing we were talking about, BASF in Huntington, for a minute?
In fact, that's where I want to head back to. All right, yeah, fine, do it.
Yeah, this lady that I know who went to my high school, whose grandfather worked for Standard Ultramarine and was in the CAP and knew the Nazis and everything, she said she had a premonition of 911 about 20 years ago. And I was like, well, I remember her from college. She was very elusive, and she was an international studies major, and I don't think she was in it for being a spy or anything. I just think she was kind of a freelance person, just wanted to see the world. But she was in Russia, and I think they probably tagged her, well, she's an international studies major, let's watch her. So she says she's in Russia, and the thing is she can't remember what city it happened in. It's all a blur. The whole trip becomes a blur for her, and she can't remember the details. But somehow during that trip, she gets this premonition of 911, and then right after it happened, she got a bunch of emails that seemed like coded language, and they were coming from an Islamic terrorist group or something. And she kept getting them and getting them. It freaked her out and basically broke up her marriage. And she said she stayed off the computer for a couple of years. But then I found out that a researcher whose name escapes me at the moment, had the same thing happen. And he figured out that it was a way that the Russians send messages. They send pieces of the code in each email, and then you're supposed to forward it to someone else who collates the messages. But what this all points to is, what if the Russians knew about from the early on, after the building of the towers, or maybe even before, knew that they were being built in order to bring them down later as a symbol. And what if they tried to transmit that to just average Americans via telemetry? I mean, I've been saying that this is Mothman, or speculating the Mothman was doing this, and it kind of looks like that's connected. But there may be a synthetic part of it, too.
Right. That's, well, and it also could be, if you hook into certain of these archetypes, like Jung called them, and I mean, warning, what do you want to call them, specters, or visions, and all through history, human history, there's always been, people, especially in the ancient days, in the classical cultures, I mean, they put tremendous value in omens, whether it was flights of birds or whatever it may have been. And even in something close to home, and there's old legend in southern New Jersey that if you see a white stag deer, a white buck that, crossing the road, that there would be danger ahead of some kind. This was not something to be ignored, by people. And we have this, in every culture, there's always some vision of some creature or some thing that always serves as a warning, an omen of dire consequence to come. And clearly Mothman fits that archetype. Whether it's it's interesting that again, it's something that it's a flying creature. It appears prior to some disaster. It kind of fits. It fits the archetype. Here in eastern West Virginia, there's something that people they call it the black form or the black dog. Sometimes the truckers have picked up on that. And it's the same thing.
The black dog, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm, same thing. There's this my stepson and a couple of his friends got the jeebers scared out of them one night. They were driving north of Harpers Ferry. They're at the foot of the Blue Ridge, right by the Potomac River, and this in a black form just appeared out of nowhere, obscured the entire view of the road in front of them. And when they slowed down, they got so startled. And apparently there was ahead of them the road had been washed out, and there was a awful accident that had taken place. And if they hadn't slowed down, they would have driven right into the same ravine. So it's again, this is what's driving these visions. And the thing is, if somebody is able to hook into that, figure out what the what the energies are that are creating these visions, if they're being, are they function of our mind, or are they function of the there's some, earth forces, like I said, telluric energies, whatever it may be. But if you know how to either read, manipulate, or control these things, that would be, very much what you were talking about, Andy. It's just that's why, I remember the last time we spoke, whenever these people start wanting to concretize and chase these critters down like they're going to catch them in a butterfly net, the cryptozoologist, it's like, it's just, it's that much, hooey as far as I'm concerned. You're not going to catch an archetype in a live trap.
I've been noticing connections between the people who have these experiences and like their families. Like, you notice that a lot of them, their family members worked for some element of the defense industry, like that woman I was just talking about. And then there's another guy that I recently reconnected with who lived on Woodward Drive and actually lived in the house where everybody was seeing Mothman, but he was the second kid that lived in there. And I never knew this before, but he said, hey, I encountered that thing too. He said it grabbed him from behind at the same spot where I saw it and Harriet saw it. And it was invisible. He thinks. Not sure. He was afraid to turn around, but it was pulling him down, and he had to physically fight it off and run home. Well, he now works for AEP, running barges on the Ohio River. And he told me an interesting story about a couple of them. One involved the Belleville Locks, which is where Indrid Cold apparently used to land his flying saucer, right next to it. And he said that the Belleville Locks got it. I think I may have mentioned this before with Viz, but it got shut down for several weeks because somebody went through the wrong way, and they had to lock up the barge during a flood, and it almost, was straining. You could hear the metals. You could hear the dams squeaking, as he said, But it cost millions of dollars a day to local industry. And you could almost, if you're really paranoid, see that as a potentially a sabotage thing where it was meant to, inflict some damage on the region for some reason. Maybe it wasn't just an accident because it was very odd. He said that they even tried to do that. 2 barges tried it to go through the wrong way. They also said that he knew a guy in Point Pleasant who had been abducted by aliens, quote, aliens, but that it happened at a car wreck scene. He's driving up, he sees what looks like a car wreck, and he gets abducted. Now, this is what happened the night Indrid Cold first showed up. There's a picture in a magazine article from the 70s that shows a car wreck that same night, just a mile away. This is an old wartime tactic that the Nazis probably used, and, whoever, to have a fake roadblock. But the black dog thing, by the way, I think when Eisenhower was referring to the military-industrial complex, he was probably talking about the Nazis, the Nazi part of it, the companies that were colluding with the Nazis during the war, because he obviously would have known that. And he was sort of warning about that. And so they couldn't get all the Nazi saucers rebuilt very fast. It took them a while to get the patents and kind of make it all, get it all squared away. It wasn't until about 1960 that they finally did that. And so it took them about 5 years. And this is my theory. They took them about 5 years to build some more. And then that's when you had all the UFOs in Point Pleasant. Now, getting back to my friend who grew up on Woodward Drive, he now lives in Point Pleasant, and he hangs around in the TNT area all the time. So when we were there last time at the festival, they weren't letting anybody in there anymore because we had an explosion a couple of months ago. And there were men in black, although they weren't dressed in black. There were definitely some men in black at the festival photographing people.
Yeah.
And I was clued into maybe there's something going on. They don't want us maybe to find out anything else about the TNT area because recently there's been, at least I've been talking about it perhaps being a place where they were making these Nazi saucers. Because my friend who's lives there now and is a hunter said he had run across these enormous water tanks, circular things up in the mountains near the airport. And we looked at it on the map and so forth, and I noticed that they don't seem to have tops on them. And I started thinking, well, maybe that's where, if they were building them underground like they were at the Dora facility in Germany, which was a sister plant to Carbide. The front operation was one thing. Like, for instance, at Auschwitz, they had a Buna factory that was supposedly making Buna, or synthetic rubber. Right. They never actually turned any out, yet they were using more electricity than the city of Berlin. So they were probably doing uranium enrichment or just building these crazy craft. Well, what I'm saying is here you have a guy, my friend, who had this experience when he was young. He sees the number 1111 all the time, and we talked about that before. But, he's found a key piece of evidence, a couple of them, And the story about the car wreck scene really now starts to make a lot of sense. And, he's finding out clues, and he's not even interested in really finding out anything. He doesn't really want his name used either, probably. I haven't really talked to him about that, but he works for AEP, so he probably doesn't want that out there. But the Black Dog story about Point Pleasant is one that's been floated for a long time. There's this Major Downing story that's been out there for 10 years maybe, that explains it in terms of the black dogs. And if you just substitute, if you look at that, you can find it on the internet. Just type in, what would you type in? Major Downing. And it actually gives the best explanation for what was going on. If they were indeed making all of this special equipment, anti-gravity stuff underground there, it explains why you can say that there were strange radio frequencies in the air that might have brought the bridge down, for instance, the Silver Bridge. And explains why there's always been this rumor that people were being hit with these rays. Because when you turn on the Nazi Bell weapon, or any of these vortices-based engines, they create this, destructive magnetic field around them. So that's why people who get too close to these saucers, would get burns and things. Or even melt. I mean, apparently if they turned it on full blast, it would basically just melt people.
Andy, if I could ask you, with the companies that are out in that area, and Robert had said something and you had said something, I just want to clear something up. Mm-hmm. Was it your understanding that Carbide did break up and then somehow, some way got reunited again?
Well, they spun off some parts, but they kept the bulk of it together, and it's owned by Dow, but they're still operating as Carbide.
Here's what I want to ask you guys.
Which is interesting because Dow traditionally was Carbide's biggest competitor, which is a really strange sort of, again, this incestuous, weird relationship.
But Robert,
the Russians have always been competitive with the Germans, which is why they might be more likely to be trying to spill the beans about stuff, about the Nazis and what they were up to.
Right.
But here's what I want to throw back to you guys, and this is where I was headed. You call it incestuous, Robert. What I'm wondering is, I don't think that, I haven't taken continue to keep a close look on things, but you get hit with stuff every day and you kind of take note of it. Here, where I'm going with is I don't know if we can call it monopoly anymore because it seems to cut across certain industries, but it's the same companies that are getting involved in the same industries, and it's like everything's getting scapped up. Point being is that if you took a look at your corner gas station, and things are up by you anyway they are down here. I've seen gas stations change over 3 times.
Yep.
And it's like, Standard Oil's back together again. Because Mobil's in with, something else and BP and all that. And it just seems to me, and of course now this Google thing with Verizon, it's like, okay, we don't call it monopoly, therefore it isn't. But you have companies now that are going to become absolutely mega players, right. But they'll have their hands in everything across the board.
Well, let's look at oil, for instance, the oil raw material, actual petroleum as they're pumping it. It doesn't go, it goes into basically a pool. It's not like the oil that's being pumped by BP out of the ground is just going to BP's refineries necessarily. And it's traded as a commodity. So that's part of that's really where the incestuous relationship begins. It starts there. The fact that it's not like they're going in and they're just saying, this is our oil and we're going to make it into our gasoline and sell it in our gas stations. It's not, it hasn't been that way for years. And it started out as a monopoly, and I think that monopolistic, way of managing that resource has never ended.
No, in fact, if anything, the story goes is that after, Rockefeller busted a move and had his Standard Oil. And then he had Teddy Roosevelt come out, and shake his fist and talk about busting up the trust and all that. Right. And then the story goes, while Teddy was doing that, Philander Knox, the lawyer for the robber barons, was like undoing whatever Teddy was doing. So, and Teddy knew the game also. And so they were happy because now that the horse is out of the barn, by all means, close the gates. I'm gone. Right. We're all right, you know. So
that's the same thing like with the AT&T long lines. I mean, everybody, you know, they sort of when they so-called broke up the Bell system, which actually was originally New Jersey Bell.
That's right.
You know, interestingly enough. Everybody was crowing about this, what a triumph it was. It's no longer a monopoly, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, the bottom line is these local phone companies, they still buy and have to lease their right to the, you know, their access to the long line system from AT&T. And AT&T was the parent company, of course, was the Bell system, which was New Jersey Bell.
Right.
And these facilities are, you know, they're remarkably hardened too, which I don't think a lot of people completely realize is just how hardened that whole system is. I mean, and I remember as a kid, my dad worked for New Jersey Bell, and he took us to, it took me as a youngster, I guess I couldn't have been more than 8, 9 years old, something like that, to what was the original headquarters of the Bell system in Newark, New Jersey. And we went through the building, and I remember he took us down many stories. I can't remember how far down under the ground we went, but it was the elevator went down, I know, a ways. And as a little boy, I was fascinated by the fact that that there was and this is back, we're talking in the late 1950s, all right, early 1960s, I guess it would be. It was probably around 1961. There was the way to get into the computer facility, which is where my dad worked, was guarded by these by a giant door that was controlled by an electric eye. And I thought that was the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen in my life, was this electric eye that, you know, you break the beam and the door is open. But I'll never forget, my dad looked at me and he said, "See these doors, Robert? These doors can resist we're so far underground and these doors are so thick that this can resist the explosion of the most powerful hydrogen bombs that anybody can make." And this is in 1961, and that was the hub. That was the hub of the Bell Systems, you know, control system. And you know, so this is where, you know, when you talk about what's underneath our feet, you know, there's sort of hints. You know, I've had personal experience with, you know, the hints of what can be down there, seeing it with my own eyes. You know what I mean? And my dad was clearly had access to this stuff. So it was, but that was and I'm sure that gigantic vault underneath the old Bell System headquarters there, which is probably, I guess, Verizon now.
Right.
I'm sure it's still there.
No doubt.
I'm sure it hasn't gone anywhere.
What I want to ask you too, Robert, heading back in time again, in the Appalachian area. And because of so many of these industries, chemical and petroleum-based or whatever, sprang up in and around there, could it possibly be that the Appalachians are very rich in resources and just one of those areas that we kind of don't tap because, you know, we have this story on the national scene that we're always looking for oil, blah, blah, blah. Right. But are the Appalachians rich in minerals and? Absolutely.
I mean, not so much in I wouldn't say so rich in petroleum, perhaps, but a good example. I mean, there were hard rock mines some of the deepest hard rock mines ever dug, whatever you want to call it, in the United States were literally dug in northern New Jersey and southern New York. Many of them are iron mines. There was the old zinc mines in Franklin, New Jersey. And these mines were, you know, it wasn't like they mined everything out. I mean, there's still tremendous resources in the Appalachians. It was just that it was simply easier
to go somewhere else,
to go after the iron out there, like in the Superior District of Michigan. It was just simply closer to the surface. You don't have to go as deep, that kind of thing. But the other thing is with these deep hard rock mines, again, I mean, you start digging into solid rock like that. That's in a relatively stable area. It also gives you access to the underground, and that's something that's taken advantage of. You know, Andy, I remember you did that one show where I think Harriet was doing some remote viewing into the facility at Sugar Grove, which is a facility I'm very familiar with, and I actually know people who've worked at Sugar Grove.
It doesn't show up on the Google Maps.
No, it doesn't. But you can see the dishes from the top of Reddish Knob. all right, which is interesting. So they don't seem to care about the fact that you can see the dishes, but yeah, you're right. The facility itself does not show up on Google Earth. The base does. The base housing?
No, the base doesn't.
Oh, the base doesn't at all either?
Well, I don't know now, but the last time I checked, the base wasn't. You could see the dishes, but not the base. It's a lot bigger.
Okay. But my from knowing people who've worked at Sugar Grove, and basically what, for the listeners, the people who don't know what this facility is, it essentially functions today as the central command headquarters, as far as almost like the command for the signal corps, essentially, that gives the orders to the fleet all over the world as to where to go and what. It's essentially where they receive their orders from. And that facility, I'll tell you, Harriet had it nailed, because it just goes and goes and goes underground. I mean, it's a very cleverly designed facility in the sense that, if those antennae and satellite dishes get knocked off on the surface, they can be very quickly replaced. But this facility itself is embedded in a particularly interesting type of shale, and that shale, by its very nature, all shales to a degree have water in their structure, but that particular shale has both water and some hydrocarbons in its structure, and it absolutely would block any attempt to try to sort of drill in there with either electromagnetic waves or anything like that. In other words, nothing gets in and nothing gets out as far as, radio transmissions, that kind of stuff. You can't peer into this facility. And at the same time, you can't broadcast out of the facility, because.
But Harriet was able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But Harriet was able to do it.
That's right, and that's because she's not functioning with whatever frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum, so to speak.
Lastly, about this area in the modern era, if we could, right, and then we'll go backwards. The other thing, whether it lends to the mystique, either supernaturally or just in other ways, that area has also become a place for, shall we say, clandestine government ops, or at least, when you talk about Mount Weather and such, nobody really knows what's going on out there, but something definitely is. And I think X-Files, with Chris Carter, having access to certain government operations, you got that in the X-Files series, and I've talked about with Andy and such, and it's like, okay, now how much of this is really true? Because after a while, I think I get it. Like, you give me an elbow in the ribs enough with this. So what is going on out there? And that's what I want to throw to you guys also. The last thing about this thing is that this area, it's that it's been chosen, apparently, to shield certain, perhaps personages and also perhaps projects. Anybody want to grab on that?
You want to go first?
Restate that. I was looking at my notes. Sorry.
Yeah, you weren't listening. Okay. No. All right. Go in the corner and stand there for 5 minutes. You can't partake in this. No, what I was saying about the area also being very much infiltrated, perhaps below ground more than anything else, with government installations, some operations perhaps. We know that, that Mount Weather is supposedly where our brain trust would go in D.C., come the big one. So, again, I mean, does that have something to do with the whole mystique of the area also? Is there a lot of this just cloaked in a certain kind of secrecy that just hangs over the place like a pall?
Well, yeah, it does hang over the place. I mean, it is. It's very much, that's part of it. The TNT area, when they were in the 60s, they had to go in blacked out school buses, the workers. I started thinking about that. I'm like, why would you need to do that for TNT manufacture? That you wouldn't necessarily, there's the nitro factory, the one that's the city that's involved, the central node of this lawsuit, from where dioxin was being spread everywhere, was coming from nitro. So, but they didn't have that kind of security there, right? So why were they doing it at the TNT area in the 60s? It doesn't make any sense, because the war was long over. Unless they were doing something else, and it's clearly atomic, some of it, because that's been hinted at in a lot of different ways, including Geiger counter readings. But there's this red stuff that's oozing out of the ground and they're saying that it's a TNT product or a product of TNT, but maybe it's mercury-based, and that would be what they were using in these craft.
Right, so-called red mercury.
Yeah. So,
well, Andy, let me ask you this, and I think you've already stated this is the case, but for myself and for the listeners, if that is the case, that whatever's there is being hooked up with some kind of super cloaked aircraft, would you say that area does have an overabundance of what we would call UFO sightings? Like they might be taking the thing out for a test run. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's exactly my theory at this point.
Right.
They were building them, they were testing them, because they were running on a regular schedule. And they were probably popping up out of those towers, because they're large enough that you could, they're enormous. He was saying it was like it took you half an hour to walk around them.
The craft?
No, the round towers.
Oh, the towers themselves. Okay.
Yeah, and then so I told John Frick, the Frick brothers, about this. He met my friend, and they said, "Well, we'll go up there and check it out." He went up there and he reported back with the strangest story. He said he got up there, and it was dusk, and they were tired, and they looked up, and there were 3 towers. And he writes me back and he goes, "Aren't there 3 towers up there?" And I said, "No, 2." And we look on the Google map, and there's only 2. And so he's wondering what's going on. He thinks it's a time slip. And I'm like, so I said, well, if it's time slip, you must have gone back into time to when they had 3 towers in a psychic vision of some kind. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us some things. It's like you certainly wouldn't need 3 water towers. It got me thinking along those lines, and then boom, suddenly I realized, well, that's where they were taking off from. And it's close to the airport, so they could sort of get wrapped up in the airport traffic or have the airport help them.
Mm-hmm. Right, and the thing is, it's interesting. There's some connection with water all the time with these sightings as well. For instance, remember there was the spate of sightings that was going on near Wanacue Reservoir.
Oh yes.
There's another spate of sightings that went on at the Loch Raven Reservoir outside of Baltimore.
And also the Oradell Reservoir southeast of Wanacue, yeah.
Yep. So there's some connection between...
And doesn't anybody ask the question, if we've got drones flying all over the place now, bombing people, well, how the hell, they didn't just come up with those yesterday.
No, right.
This is how they did it. And they tested and they made people think they were UFOs, and they had to sort of go along with that whole story while they built all these and perfected technology. But now I just heard a story this morning about people in Pakistan who are getting bombed. They are having these terrible psychological reactions to these drones. Think about it. Think about if you had to look out for one, and you hear them. They sound like bees, apparently, and it just sends terror through people's bodies. They're just because they don't know what it is that they might do that might get them shot. There's no rules, no legalities have been laid out to the American taxpayer for sure. No, there's been no discussion of what's the legality of this.
But don't we all kind of assume, and perhaps maybe know if any of you have information, that what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan of late is pretty much, I think, probably a practice session.
It's a testing ground.
Yes, and those people are being obviously used as targets.
Now, you mentioned earlier about the hard rock mines. John Keel investigated a 1970s case near Charleston at a mine where 2 miners, it wasn't an active mine. They may have been hunters or something, but they were confronted by 2 buzzing orbs, metal spheres flying around at the entrance to the mine. Now, think about that. I mean, that ties it together to some degree. One of the purposes for these things is that they can monitor all of these old sites and things that they're sort of keeping on hold, where there is still stuff in there. There still is resource in there. And that way they can keep track of everything much more cheaply, I would imagine. And the things might even be able to fly into the mine.
Right.
And come back out.
And by the way,
and the thing is, in the Appalachians, one of the things to keep in mind is one of the reasons why they weren't able to mine economically a lot of these ore bodies, especially these enormous concentrations of iron and nickel, these heavy metals, was because of the fact that they were dipping steeply along the bedding into the ground, thousands of feet down. And described sometimes, the ore bodies are almost described like beads on a string that go down into the ground. And the thing is that any time you get iron ore that's arranged in that sort of a configuration, one of the main ores of iron in the Appalachians is magnetite. Now, magnetite it's named that for a reason, because it's magnetic. Now, if you have an ore body that's thousands of feet deep and hundreds of feet wide, and the whole thing is magnetic, all right, what is that doing? Is it acting as a giant receiver or transmitter? Is it setting up some kind of a magnetic or electromagnetic field around it? Then of course the answer is absolutely. It absolutely is. There's if you look at the magnetic anomaly maps for northern New Jersey, there's these places that are just, glowing hot. I mean, as far as the where it departs way from the background. And, and this is sort of, these are sort of, kind of rods driven, if you will, into the crust of the earth. And what better place if you're going to take advantage of these telluric or earth energies, what better place to do it than something like that. And it all kind of, comes together in a sense.
And here's what I want to ask you guys about also, with regard to that section of the Ohio Valley. And, when you were talking about hot spots, I was going to even ask you, I mean, do you know that any of them are in the Ramapos?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. But remember, we're talking about now, the thing is, in the Ohio Valley, you've got a different sort of situation, because there, and it's a good example is the mounds. You've got these mound builder cultures, and they seem to have this urge, or what do you want to call it, to build these structures that are basically, sort of man-made little mountains. And the question is, and that was the same thing with the Mesoamerican cultures. So some of the big, like the pyramids at Teotihuacan or whatever, they always build them over the top of a cave of some kind or some kind of subsurface opening. And what are they doing? I mean, what's the conjunction that's taking place there? Some of the big mounds, like the mound the largest Adida mound that still survives in Moundsville, unfortunately it was ransacked by a lot of the pot hunters and amateur archaeologists back in the late 1700s and 1800s. But we know that it had burial chambers inside of it, and these were hollows. They were still there, and the chambers were lined, of all things, with mica, and the mica was imported from North Carolina. Well, what else was lined with mica? The little sanctuaries, the temples that were on top of the Mayan and other Mesoamerican pyramids also were lined with mica. Now, mica, what makes it special? You say, well, it's sort of a mineral, it's shiny, it's pretty, it splits up into plates. But mica has another characteristic, which is very, very interesting. There was a big boom in mining mica in North Carolina in the Blue Ridge during the late 1930s and early 1940s. The reason they needed mica was because it can literally block alpha and gamma radiation. It's one of the best filtering and blocking minerals for lining chambers where you want to refine or experiment upon radioactive materials. Now the question is, why are the Adena lining tombs with mica? Is it just because it's pretty, or are they building some kind of a battery where the departed their spiritual force, their psychic energy can be stored and can return and emerge from at will? Why are the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the other cultures in the Mesoamerica lining the pyramids with mica. Well, what was brought inside those chambers, as soon as the sacrifice was performed, the person's heart that had been torn from their body was immediately brought into the little temple that was lined with this substance, and a lot of ancient cultures said that was the seat of the person's energy, their main, and whatever, of course, was seated in their heart. And so the question is, are you trying to keep something in? Are you trying to keep something out? Or are you doing both?
Mm-hmm.
But there's this, I was always intrigued by the fact that, we know that the mica that was being taken to Central America and to Mexico, it was coming from North Carolina, because we can actually trace the nature of the mineral just by its structure and its color and things like that. And so there was this big, trade network going on. People were actually, the Native Americans are mining mica in North Carolina and sending it to Mexico to be used in pyramids there. And this is the same exact mica that is then going to be mined in the 20th century by American nuclear engineers. So it's what's going on here?
So this sounds like a good place to do to hawk my wares.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, go for it.
No, but I am going to be going to California to hang out the Integratron. We're going to be doing some filming. Adam Go-Rightly has a documentary he's working on.
Oh.
And
you and Redfern are going out there?
Yeah, apparently it's an Australian crew. I don't know exactly, what the setup is, but we are going to the Integratron, which excites me because this is a great place because it is that mound shape, and it's the most perfect acoustical space there is. So I'm sure there's debate about, other people would say no, but it's got to be a great echoing chamber because the mounds in Point Pleasant are like that. The domes where they keep the munitions, some of them you could go in there and it would just echo and echo and echo. And that, I think, is the concept, where you can continue the life force longer by having it echo. It just keeps reflecting inside of that space.
Yeah, it reverberates, and that's it's interesting because we look at these, if you look at, for instance, some of the ruins of places like Chaco Canyon, where you have these enormous Anasazi ruins, and number one, they have, especially the biggest site there is the biggest ruin is actually shaped like an enormous crescent, and there's hundreds and hundreds of rooms. The only problem with Chaco, and is the fact that these rooms don't look like they were ever designed to be lived in. They have no windows. The doors, many of them were sealed. And the question is what was this structure for? Was it you almost start to get the feeling that it was to keep something in, not you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That it was like they were trying to hold something in rather than have some place to live. And this is and we see this over and over again in some of these cultures in the Southwest. I was very good friends with the site archaeologist and caretaker for a place in Arizona called Casa Malpais. It's outside of just outside of the town of Springerville. And at Casa was the same thing. They were working closely with the Zuni. It's considered to be a site that it's a part of the Mugyong culture, but the Zuni trace their origins to the Mugyong. And they found some undisturbed rooms that were apparently used as burials, and they called the Zuni in to really kind of supervise. They didn't, because of the Antiquities Act, they can't just go mucking into a burial these days. And the Zuni said, what you can do, as far as we're concerned, is you can open a small hole, you can put a camera down inside the chamber to photograph what's in there, but no human is allowed to enter. And as soon as you're done with the reconnaissance, you are to seal that hole back up and seal it up for good. All right, but no one is to go in there, and the hole has to stay small, only big enough to admit a camera. And that's what they did.
What that points to is that they're not so much afraid that that person's going to get hurt, but that the spirit will enter that person
Right.
and get out.
Right.
You're right.
Right. That's the key right there. And, we have a lot of, all through human history, there's an awful lot of cultures where, the big obsession with the dead is that you have to placate them, because if you don't, dire consequences are going to result. And that there's these hungry ghosts that are going to, do some bad things if you don't do everything just right. And this is all, I mean, this kind of cuts across cultural lines. We see it in an awful lot of different cultures where the, funerary rites aren't conducted properly and things aren't done the way they're supposed to be. In some cultures, they short circuit it. There's what we call, ritual cannibalism, where in fact some cultures they literally they felt that it was important to actually ingest a tiny amount of the dead relative, so you purposely took their spirit into you, and that gave them perpetual life, so to speak, and it kind of kept them at ease.
That was an inoculation.
Yeah. But it's a very, and this is strict ritual cannibalism. It wasn't where they're having a feast on a dead body. They're taking a tiny fragment of that body, and very often it was the bone, ash from the bones, the cremated bones. But we see this kind of over and over again in an awful lot of cultures, so there's this idea of somehow you either have to contain these hungry ghosts or you have to incorporate them, one or the other. And I know that when I actually Miles, who was the archaeologist at Casa, gave me permission. I think it was an earlier show, Keith, we talked about this before. Mm-hmm. But I remember he let me go down into what they know for a fact was the catacombs, where there was hundreds of burials at Casa.
All right, I want to ask you a question. I'm going to throw to both of you.
Sure.
From what Andy has said and for what you have said, and I'm thinking also about Scripture, and now I'm starting to wonder with this whole idea of not letting something get out. And, there is an intriguing thing about what's below us, whether Antarctica is a portal of some import, I don't know. But this whole idea of what is in the earth. So what I'm asking you guys is this. Has humankind, for civilizations, perhaps in some spots more than others, whatever reason, been dealing with a force below that isn't necessarily nice, but is there, they're aware of it, and it has to be contained, lest it be loosed upon the world. I'm not really trying to be funny or melodramatic, but is this a possibility that we're dealing with?
Well, look at one of the greatest horror writers of the 20th century, H.P. Lovecraft. Okay. Every time that he speaks about the unspeakable horror, the blasphemous forms as he describes them, that these creatures from some the elder times, the ancient times before mankind, where are they? They're always, there's in the Mountains of Madness, you have to go through a cave that leads to a deep passage that's in the Antarctic. So that's where the Mountains of Madness are located. They're always issuing up from beneath the earth in Lovecraft's stories. And the question is Lovecraft just making this stuff up out of pure imagination, or is he hooking into some kind of archetype that's there? And I opt for the latter, that he hooked into some archetype, and, this is, as far as Lovecraft was concerned, New England was just honeycombed with, subterranean passages that led to, the realm of these blasphemous forms and horrors, as he called them.
And remember, in Scripture it talks about, especially Revelation, which plays in, I think, even more so, given where we are. But it talked about, from time memoriam, like there were giants in the earth, and there were great insects in the earth. And then I think also about, I had done an interview with regard to Jules Verne, and some of the stuff that he wrote about, of course, which was sometimes directed right underneath us, and perhaps giving away too much of the esoteric knowledge. Hence, there was an assassination attempt on him. But I'm not just using that, as like the archetype, but time and time again, this comes up. Are we dealing with something that we have no idea the magnitude of the force below us that will one day be loosed? And I mean, Andy, do you want to jump in on that, or is that like not your purview, or what?
Yeah, I've got some ideas on this, and I've been piecing a couple things together here as you're talking. This is a great subject. Yes, you can I think. Well, it's going to take me a minute to explain this. I will start with GE. Okay. Believe it or not. Okay. So this mound shape we're talking about, first of all, is not only seen at the Integratron, but it's seen in the Nazi Bell device. Now, who built that? It was AEG, which is General Electric in Germany. So, yeah, they were using Nazi scientists, but GE was in control. So they create this device. It's shaped like a mound. They put 4 or maybe different numbers of, but the basic one was 4 vortices spinning inside of it, centrifuges, creating a resonance. And then when you introduce mercury and stuff, it puts off different waves, and some of them are, they're all over the spectrum, and they could melt if you turn it up all the way. It could literally disintegrate a person. Other effects might be some sort of reflective invisibility, where it starts to mimic or reflect the molecules around it. So all you would see is like a bright light, maybe, or maybe it would appear to be somewhat invisible. So one of these. This is what was suspected to have landed at Kecksburg in 1965, a device that looked just like this. And there's a theory that it was purposely guided there by the Nazis. It took off from Antarctica and came down from the north and then landed. It took a left turn as it was coming over Ohio and then went right to Kecksburg. And then they took it after they recovered it, they took it to Columbus. And then there's an NSA guy out there who's a physicist whose brother wrote an article called The Egg of Columbus, and it involved invisibility and the same principles, basically. And I've written about him in a couple of my previous books. So it went to Columbus, then it goes to Wright Pat. Now, Wright Pat is right in the middle of all the GE. GE was basically, that's where they build the big engines for the space shuttle, and at least at that time, it was mostly Ohio. Now they're making things in West Virginia, in Rocket City. So you could kind of look at Rocket City, the Clarksburg area, as another node where all this kind of stuff goes on. So we've got this device, probably, and we've had it for a while, and we've been playing around with it. And what might be happening with putting dead people in mounds is not just keeping the life force resonating longer, but you notice that it's sort of blocking it out from the sky, and it's letting it commune with the earth. And we don't seem to have a problem with putting our dead in the earth. So that I think is a grounding out process where the earth sort of grounds out or softly, absorbs it over time. And there might be something beneficial about that in terms of our spirits. But what I think can happen is if you unsettle the earth with a device like this thing that we're talking about, it could send signals down into the earth that could, quote, unleash demonic forces. Because do you think the earth is going to like having this weird device that potentially, if it were cranked up enough, could start cracking, the crust?
Right.
But not. So what you might see from that is the emergence of planetary spirits that are negative, which is exactly what we've seen in these places during these certain time periods that we're talking about. And what is the archetypal solution for that situation where you have planetary spirits coming out? It's the Garuda. The Garuda subdues planetary spirits. So that explains why you would see Mothman more in these areas. So I think it points more toward the fact that they may have had one of these devices in Point Pleasant.
Right.
And that could have brought the bridge down.
Well, and Oh, I'm sorry, Andy, go on.
Simply turning that thing on and turning it up, if the bridge got weak enough. And
do you think, Andy, that was a test run, or you think that was an oops?
What do you mean, the collapse?
I mean, given the scenario...
I think, if they were running this thing all the time, it probably weakened the bridge over time.
All right, so it would have been an oops. It wasn't like, let's see how this thing works and let's take the bridge down.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, but and the thing is, you got to remember too, that adds to this, is that it's kind of like a snake biting its own tail, in the sense you've got areas there, like these islands out in the middle of the Kanawha River, or the islands in the up in the Pittsburgh area, in the Allegheny and Ohio River, where there was literally hundreds of mounds, and these mounds were all plowed under and ripped asunder, so to speak. The mound in Moundsville was burrowed into and sort of ripped open at its heart. The Creel Mound is one of the only one in Charleston and West Virginia that's still actually relatively intact. The big mound in Moundsville is not. And so whatever was, again, if something was being contained, obviously it was released. And so, it's kind of, again, why is all this strange stuff going on there? Well, it could be because that stuff was never meant to be released. And, when it comes back to this, the Asgen quote from Blackfish, where, he's talking to the white settlers, wanted to know why none of the Native Americans, settled or did anything in that region. And there was no permanent settlements. And, and he said, quote, we're never allowed to kill game wantonly. We are forbidden to settle in the country. If we did, these ghosts, meaning the ghosts of the Asgen who built the mounds, would not rise from their caves and mounds and slay us, but they would set father against son and son against father and neighbor against neighbor and make them kill one another. And it's and now, of course, we have, cities, towns, villages, and in many of them, these mounds that the Native American people during historic times were clearly not comfortable with, were plowed open or plowed under and desecrated. And the question is, what was let loose?
Well, there were a lot of suicides amongst people that I knew growing up. There were guys that killed their whole family. There wasn't a lot of those, but there were a couple. And I think what happened, it's easily masked by poverty. They can just blame his crazy acts on, somebody went in the army and he came back for a year, after a year or two and he killed himself. That happened. So, you can blame it on the army, but maybe it's the place.
Right.
And maybe it's what happened there that's affecting people. And, just to touch on that acorn shape again, that's a Masonic symbol. That thing is floating above, if you look at some of the particular aprons, that Masonic acorn has been around for a long time, hundreds of years, so maybe even longer. So this bell device is another example of taking an ancient symbol and finding out what it technologically could do, because that's probably, there's a lot of people believe that we have been advanced many times before, and that the secrets continue to be generated and propagated by the symbols that are left.
Right. And these are, again, harks back to these ideas that there are these archetypal images and shapes. And those archetypes don't change. The archetypes remain the same. Whether it's an obelisk or a pyramid or an acorn or a mandala or whatever.
What I want to ask you guys about too, and I'm trying here to rack my brain of remember what I saw, but I can't grab a hold of it. We've all kind of been told about ley lines, and I've never asked you guys about it. But then I came across something, and I'm so sorry, I'm vague about this, but it seemed like this was beyond ley lines. But no matter what I'm referring to or the ley lines themselves, can we assume this has something to do with it too? Are there some kind of veins that run underneath, or arteries, whatever you want to call them, that do have force, real energy?
Yeah, I think so. And that there's certainly evidence to suggest that, whether it's the cathedrals of Europe or the pre-Christian temples that were located where the cathedrals are now, or the Mesoamerican pyramids and sacred sites, clearly they seem to be located on lineaments, meaning linear structures. They're lined up. You can kind of point, you can draw lines between them, and this is what kind of gave rise to the whole ley line hypothesis to begin with. And at the nexus points, people call these things vortices or whatever. That there's supposed to be one of the famous ones that all these different New Agey people go to is out in Sedona. But it's kind of strange. There's supposed to be one here in the Shenandoah Valley, at a place called Means Bottom, which is kind of on the west side of the Blue Ridge, just outside of Newmarket, Virginia. Now, the strange thing about Means Bottom is it's been identified as a crossing point for ley lines and a vortex, and we had the most horrific murder that's happened probably in, I wouldn't even say recent years, probably in the past 100 years in the Shenandoah Valley, happened right there just a few years ago, and it was involved with this El Salvador gang called MS-13, where they just literally dismembered a woman. And the thing is that it seems kind of very interesting that here we've got people who are descended from Mesoamericans, and they perform this, what almost would be similar to the ritual sacrifices that their ancestors were performing on the tops of these pyramids that are located on ley lines. And where do they do it? At a ley line intersection in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And see, I don't think there's any coincidence there.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington.
Just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not out to get you.
losing my balls to the throat. All the losing my arms of sassy. She's rosy. I will some so in my foot or but all the moose stuck with that. I'm not gonna help. So I lost to see her on the fucking warfare. All the I get where he's generated. All the nights silhouettes of assassination. Over just meows. Arms so weird, I was nothing else. Oh, she's that was a monster. Oh, her, she'll be out. He's good for years. She'll lose. Whoops, and go up. What's the most? It's a circle of second. It's a piece of life. Yeah.